It began as a spectacle the world could not ignore. Two men, each larger than life in his own country, each a master of image and political theater, standing side by side before cheering crowds. Narendra Modi, the consummate Indian orator, steeped in the politics of symbolism and self-reliance. Donald Trump, the blunt-talking businessman turned president, addicted to grand gestures and superlatives. The Howdy Modi event in Houston drew over 50,000 Indian Americans and global headlines. The Namaste Trump rally in Ahmedabad a few months later was even more ambitious. Stadium lights, cultural performances, the optics of a partnership that seemed to transcend politics. For a brief time, their relationship was sold as more than diplomacy. It was marketed as a friendship, a personal bond that could anchor the India partnership for years to come. But diplomacy wrapped in personal chemistry is a fragile thing. It rests not on treaties or institutions, but on the whims, moods, and ambitions of two individuals. And both Modi and Trump are leaders accustomed to being the dominant figure in any room. Each saw the other as a useful ally, a symbol that could be showcased back home to strengthen domestic standing. For Trump, Modi was proof that America could have strong partners in the Indo-Pacific without costly commitments. For Modi, Trump was an endorsement of India's rising global clout. But beneath the warmth, fault lines were already forming. Trade was the first battleground. Trump's worldview was transactional. Allies were judged on how much they opened their markets to American goods, how much they bought from U.S. companies, and how much they bent their domestic rules to suit American business interests. India, with its protective trade policies, data sovereignty rules, and complex tariffs, quickly became a source of irritation. Washington wanted greater access for American dairy, medical devices, and agricultural goods. It wanted India to roll back restrictions on e-commerce giants and soften its push for data localization. Modi, aware of how concessions would play among his nationalist base, pushed back. To him, opening the gates too wide would mean surrendering strategic industries and undermining Make in India a core part of his economic vision. The impasse was predictable, and Trump responded the way he knew best, by imposing tariffs. It was a move straight out of his playbook, designed not only to punish but to signal strength to his domestic audience. The U.S. revoked India's preferential trade status under the generalized system of preferences, cutting off billions in duty-free exports. The message was clear: friendship was welcome, but it did not buy immunity from America's trade arsenal. In India, this was read not just as economic pressure, but as a public slight, proof that warm handshakes in stadiums did not shield New Delhi from Washington's coercive tools. Then came the Russia question, the true stress test of the relationship. As the war in Ukraine dragged on, the U.S. sought to build a global coalition to economically isolate Moscow. It expected India, as a key Indo-Pacific partner, to join in cutting energy imports from Russia. Modi's government refused. Cheap Russian oil was too valuable for India's economy and too central to keeping inflation in check for ordinary citizens. Moreover, India had long-standing defense and strategic ties with Moscow that could not be abandoned without consequences. In New Delhi's view, bending to Washington's demands would compromise its strategic autonomy, the very principle that allowed India to navigate a multipolar world without becoming anyone's junior partner. To Trump, however, the refusal looked like disloyalty. His administration imposed a sweeping 50% tariff on certain Indian exports, framing it as a punishment for funding the war machine through Russian oil purchases. This was unprecedented in the modern history of the relationship. Never before had the U.S. taken such a direct and public economic shot at India over its foreign policy choices. In India, the move fueled nationalist rhetoric. It became a rallying cry for those who argued that America's friendship was conditional, that Washington's idea of partnership meant compliance, not equality. The tension soon spilled into the realm of political gestures where both men were equally skilled. At a high-profile multilateral event, Trump extended an invitation to Modi for a one-on-one meeting, billed as an opportunity to reset the tone. Modi declined, citing scheduling conflicts. On paper, it was a minor protocol matter. In practice, it was a calculated signal. India would not be drawn into theatrics on Washington's terms, and it would not rush to smooth over a rift created by unilateral U.S. pressure. Around the same time, Modi refused a public handshake with Pakistan's army chief, Asim Munir, at another event. Both refusals sent the same message: India alone would determine the optics of its diplomacy. What had once been easy camaraderie was now replaced by strategic mistrust. Trump's public remarks grew sharper, accusing India of being a tough negotiator that takes advantage of American generosity. Modi, for his part, shifted to a more guarded tone when speaking about the U.S., praising the partnership in general terms while emphasizing India's commitment to self-reliance and multipolar engagement. The joint statements became shorter, the private calls less frequent, and the warm personal references disappeared altogether. Yet the relationship did not collapse entirely. Both sides understood the larger stakes. For Washington, India remained an essential counterweight to China, a partner whose economic and military weight could tilt the balance in Asia. For New Delhi, the U.S. was still a vital source of defense technology, investment, and diplomatic support in forums where China's influence was growing. The strategic logic was intact, but the personal glue that once made cooperation smoother was gone. In its place was a cooler, more calculating partnership, one driven entirely by national interest. In the end, the Modi-Trump story became less about friendship and more about the limits of personality-driven diplomacy. Personal bonds can accelerate cooperation when interests align, but they cannot erase the structural differences between two powerful independent nations. Trade disputes, energy security, strategic autonomy, these are not matters that stadium rallies can solve. They require patience, compromise, and respect for each other's red lines. Without that, even the warmest bromance is destined to cool. The photos from Houston and Ahmedabad still exist, smiling reminders of a time when the relationship seemed effortless, but in the corridors of power in Washington and New Delhi, they are now seen as artifacts of a different chapter. The lights have dimmed, the slogans have faded, and what remains is a partnership stripped of sentiment, surviving on the hard currency of mutual necessity. That may not make for stirring campaign videos, but in the real world of geopolitics, it is often the only kind of relationship that lasts. The unraveling of the Modi-Trump dynamic did not happen in a vacuum. It took place against the backdrop of a rapidly shifting global order, where the rules of engagement between nations were being rewritten. The Indo-Pacific had become the central theater of strategic competition. China's rise, its militarization of the South China Sea, its deep economic inroads into Africa and Latin America, all of this demanded a coordinated response from the United States and its partners. For Washington, India was not just another ally in the making, it was the single largest democratic counterweight to Beijing's authoritarian reach. That strategic reality made the personal rupture between Trump and Modi even more striking. In the early years of their interaction, it was this shared concern about China that allowed the friendship to flourish. Both men could stand together on a stage and signal unity against a rising rival, but as time passed, the U.S. expectation that India would align itself fully with Washington's playbook grew unrealistic. India's foreign policy, forged over decades of non-alignment and later multi-alignment, was built on the principle of preserving independence in all major power relationships. This meant engaging with the US, Russia, China, and even adversaries like Pakistan in ways that suited India's own interests, not anyone else's timetable. The trouble for Trump was that his political brand thrived on visible loyalty. He valued public gestures of alignment, joint press conferences where leaders echoed his talking points, policy moves that could be packaged as American wins. Modi's refusal to play to that script was not personal in the Indian context, but it felt personal to Trump. The Russia oil dispute became the perfect example of these different lenses. In Washington, the purchase of discounted Russian crude after the invasion of Ukraine was framed as morally and strategically unacceptable. In New Delhi, it was viewed as a pragmatic decision to shield the Indian economy from the kind of energy shocks that could trigger runaway inflation and hurt millions of ordinary citizens. Moreover, Indian policymakers knew that Europe itself continued buying Russian gas through indirect channels, making Washington's outrage look selective. Trump's tariff punishment may have been meant to force India's hand, but it only reinforced the belief in New Delhi that the U.S. could not be counted on to respect India's right to chart its own course. This deterioration carried direct implications for the Indo-Pacific strategy. At a time when the Quad, the security dialogue between India, Japan, and Australia, was meant to be projecting unity, the personal chill between Trump and Modi made coordination more complicated. Official statements still spoke of shared values and joint exercises, but behind closed doors, Indian officials were less willing to accommodate initiatives that required political capital at home. For example, proposals for joint naval patrols in the South China Sea were slowed, and discussions about deepening defense technology sharing moved cautiously. India did not walk away from the Quad, but it made sure its commitments were shaped on its own terms. In Washington, Trump's campaign team quickly learned that taking a hard line on India played well with certain segments of the electorate. Rust Belt manufacturing workers liked hearing about standing up to countries that took advantage of America. Agricultural lobbies welcomed pressure on India to open its markets to U.S. products. Even within the strategic community, there were voices arguing that India's hesitancy on Russia proved it was an unreliable partner against China. Trump's speeches began to reflect these talking points. He still called India a friend in broad terms, but the tone had shifted: less celebration, more demand. The Howdy Modi language of brotherhood was replaced with the language of transactions and leverage. In India, the political utility of standing firm against Trump was equally strong. Modi's image as a leader who could look global powers in the eye and refuse unreasonable demands resonated with his nationalist base. In Parliament, ruling party members pointed to the tariffs and oil dispute as proof that India needed to deepen self-reliance. The idea that no foreign leader, not even one who once shared a stadium stage, could dictate India's foreign policy became a subtle but powerful campaign theme. News channels replayed footage of Modi walking past Trump's overtures for a meeting, framing it as a moment of dignity and resolve. It was not an accident that these visuals were timed to appear in the weeks before key state elections. The diplomatic machinery on both sides quietly kept lines of communication open. Defense sales continued, intelligence sharing remained active, and joint military drills proceeded. But these were now insulated from the political relationship between the two leaders. Indian officials learned to work directly with U.S. agencies and cabinet members rather than relying on presidential goodwill. American diplomats focused on institutional ties, aware that the presidential dynamic might not improve anytime soon. This was the shift from the personal phase of the relationship to the structural phase, a recognition that the national interests of both countries still overlapped, even if the leaders' personalities no longer meshed. Still, the loss of personal warmth had costs. In moments of crisis such as border tensions with China or flare-ups with Pakistan, the absence of quick informal communication between Trump and Modi meant that small incidents risked being handled through slower, more formal channels. In the past, a phone call might have clarified intentions or eased a misunderstanding. Now there was less trust that the other side would interpret such gestures charitably. In the high-speed world of modern geopolitics, where minutes can change the outcome of a standoff, that gap mattered. Internationally, China and Pakistan both saw an opportunity in the cooling of Modi-Trump ties. Beijing quietly stepped up its diplomatic charm offensive toward India, offering trade concessions and signaling openness to resolve certain border issues, though always on terms favorable to China. Islamabad meanwhile tried to exploit Washington's frustrations by presenting itself as a more flexible partner in certain counterterrorism and regional security matters. Neither effort fundamentally shifted India's strategic orientation, but they added layers of complexity to an already crowded diplomatic chessboard. By late 2025, what remained of the Modi-Trump dynamic was something pragmatic and stripped of illusion. Both leaders could still sit across a table, but gone were the performative flourishes that once defined their interactions. They no longer needed to sell each other to their domestic audiences as personal friends. Instead, each could position the other as a tough, demanding counterpart, a foil against which to demonstrate political strength. Ironically, this served both men's electoral narratives. Trump could tell his voters he was tough on India when it didn't play ball. Modi could tell us that India refused to bow, even to America. And perhaps that is the real story, that what began as a carefully choreographed display of global friendship evolved into a lesson about the durability of interests over sentiment. Nations are not bound by emotion, even when their leaders appear to be. They are bound by needs, capabilities, and the cold arithmetic of power. In that sense, the breakdown of the Modi-Trump romance was not a tragedy. It was an inevitability, a reminder that in geopolitics, personal chemistry can open doors, but only national interest keeps them from closing.